Hello and welcome to Wine Blast with me, Susie Barry, and my husband and fellow Master of Wine, Peter Richards. And this episode's a bit different from the norm because we are talking about light. There's also darkness involved. Ultimately, we're telling a story with a bit of science and more than a hint of scandal.
Oh, love that cryptic build-up. I feel we should have much more ominous music playing right now, something like The Omen or whatever.
Jaws.
You know, we don't want people to think they've stumbled onto the wrong podcast. This is still Wine Blast. We're still talking wine.
The wine stories will never end. But this is a particularly juicy and timely one, isn't it?
Yep.
Because we are talking light strike.
Yeah.
Now, you may already know a bit about this. You may know a lot. You may know nothing at all. But I can promise you some cutting-edge research, some strong views, some eye-popping numbers, and I guarantee that you'll never look at wine in quite the same way again.
I think I always look at wine the same way, which is pretty adoring.
Cross-eyed.
I think. Well, yeah, there's a bit of that, but, you know, I just gaze at bottles, you know, in awe.
Just like
mostly.
You look at me.
Absolutely. I was just about to add that.
Of course you were.
I'm a total fanboy of wine and of you, of course.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah. I think it's. Hold on a minute. It's fair to say that you don't look at all wine adoringly.
No, do you know what that is? That is true. Just like
Let's
I don't
be
look
honest.
at all girls adoringly. I'll just throw
I
that
should
in
hope
there
not.
before we move on.
No.
But no, you're right. And what we're going to say in this episode is we definitely shouldn't be looking at all wines the same way.
Exactly. Particularly those that come in clear glass bottles. Yes, we have several villains in this story, and one of the prime ones is the clear, colourless glass bottle. Another is light, also the shady marketing men and women.
Oh, shady.
As for the victims, well, it's us wine drinkers. Plus, of course, your poor, defenceless wine, which should always taste as the winemaker intended, but which sometimes doesn't. Why?
Because of light strike.
Precisely.
Light strike.
Sounds
quite cool, doesn't it, light strike, just thinking about
sort
it.
of does, doesn't
It's
it?
like some sort of Jedi Karma laser weapon or something like that. Or one of the new Marvel characters, you know, someone like Margot Robbie would play light strike.
Will she ever top Barbie? That's the question.
That's a big question. I'm not sure it's a question for here, though.
Not right, no. Anyway, light strike is definitely not good or cool, sadly. Quite the opposite. Now, to get some sort of perspective, you could put it like this. Most of us wine folk are encouraging, whether actively or passively, the sale and consumption of wine that is tainted. In the most extreme cases, your wine can seriously end up smelling like boiled cabbage or drains or wet dog.
Not quite sure which of those is worse. I mean, they all sound horrific.
Now, the scale of this problem is likely far greater than any other wine taint, and yet we don't really talk about it. By and large, we accept it. Sometimes we inadvertently embrace it. And mostly we just carry on pretending it's not an issue, while it's effectively depriving us all of our rightful enjoyment of wine. It is daylight robbery in every sense of the term. If you'll pardon the pun, sorry. But I ask you, is that cool?
The pun or the daylight robberies? Because the pun is definitely very cool in my world. The daylight robbery is definitely not cool.
No,
I agree. Not even Marvel can make that character cool.
No, so we're definitely in villain rather than hero territory here.
Villainous.
And I'd actually say the situation borders on scandalous, and it needs calling out, which is what we are going to do in this episode. We're going to explain what the issue is, look at the latest research findings, hear from winemakers and other experts, and recommend what should be done about it. We've even done our own original applied research, haven't we?
Yeah.
I'd say a semi-scientific experiment involving bottles, funnels, argon gas, and a blindfold. Which was fun, and which you too, here we go, you too can easily replicate at home should you so desire.
Rock and roll. It's definitely semi-scientific, I agree. I know
What more could you wish for?
It's like, it's not entirely scientific, it's semi-scientific.
Definitely semi.
You've also left out the fact that we went shopping as part of our research.
We did indeed.
You know, that was really important. It was also quite fun, which is not something I would normally say about shopping.
It's the first time I've ever heard you say that about shopping.
There we go.
But I'm going to hold you to it. Now, we should get started, and I'd like to kick off a bit differently by telling very briefly a well-known folk tale, The Emperor's New Clothes.
Well, this is fun. We don't have to have story time on the pod.
Well,
I
here
feel
you
like
go,
I'm sort
Jack
of
and
be
Ori.
tucking myself up and making myself comfortable.
You do whatever you like. Anyway, so this story, as I'm sure many of you will know, is about a grand emperor who is obsessed with fancy new clothes. And one day, two cunning and persuasive conmen see their opportunity. They convince the emperor they've developed the ultimate fashion statement. Clothes that are so unbelievably fine and ultra-modern and avant-garde that they are invisible to fools, or those who aren't worthy or cool enough to see them. Now, the emperor hires these men on the spot. They pretend to make the clothes and dress the emperor, who decides to parade himself around town. His officials pretend the clothes are magnificent to avoid appearing foolish. The townspeople do the same. And ultimately, it takes a small child to laughingly point out the emperor is, in fact, totally naked to make everyone come to their senses. Everyone, that is, except the emperor, who tries to style it out, too vain and proud to admit his foolishness.
I think I can see where this is going.
I'm sure you can.
Either that or I dozed off for a second.
There's no snoring.
Where can I buy those clothes? They sound amazing.
Don't you even go there. No. So yeah, the relevance of this story may already be apparent, but we'll be coming back to it in due course. In the meantime, we need to explain what on earth light strike is and why it's worthy of our time and attention.
Okay, so story time's over. Fine. Light strike. Light strike is a relatively well-known phenomenon. In wine terms, it was first studied in Champagne in the 1970s. Effectively, light is a friend to the vine in terms of growing grapes, but then it becomes an enemy to wine because wine is fragile. Essentially, light destroys wine aromas and in extreme cases can result in a wine dominated by unpleasant and slightly foul characters, the kind of things you've already mentioned.
Sparkling white and rosé wines are particularly susceptible to light strike. Red wines are more protected because of their naturally higher levels of polyphenols. Now, what causes it are chemical reactions triggered by light, particularly certain wavelengths of light. So this needs, I think, a tiny bit of explanation. Light comes in many different forms. Some invisible, like UV light, some visible, depending on their wavelengths, because light travels in waves. The kinds of light that are most damaging to wine are those with shorter wavelengths in the UVA range of the spectrum, which is invisible, and then visible light in the blue range of the spectrum. Now, for the light geeks out there, that is apparently around 370 to 440 nanometer wavelengths.
Do you think there are as many light geeks out there as wine geeks?
I don't know.
I don't know.
Maybe.
Anyway,
Maybe.
either way,
They might not be listening, but,
say hi if you are. Or if you're both.
A whole new audience.
We'll put a graphic or two up on our show notes, I think, to make this simpler to understand because it is quite complicated. And it helps actually when you see it in visual format. But anyway, in practical terms, which is the main bit, daylight, even through clouds, and bright white interior lighting, like fluorescent lights, are particularly damaging to wine. And what kind of lights do you tend to get in supermarkets?
Now, there is an easy way to prevent this whole problem happening. You protect the wine from light, both in the winemaking process and then once it's been packaged for sale. And if we're talking bottles, which is the reality for the vast majority of wine, that means the darkest possible glass. Black or dark amber is best because it blocks most light, particularly the most damaging wavelengths that we've mentioned.
What's not good at all is putting the wine into clear, colourless glass because that lets most light through, including the most harmful kinds. And what kind of wine tends to get bottled in clear glass? The most vulnerable kinds of wine, of course, rosé, white, and some sparkling. And because these clear wine bottles will almost certainly see some light in their journey from the winery to your glass, in some cases for pretty extended periods of time, on the shelf or in the shop window, then the wines will almost inevitably be affected by this problem to some extent.
But what's the big deal? I hear you say. If it's such a big issue, how come I've never come across it? Surely you're overhyping this, or there'd be more complaints and returned bottles. Well, This is where we wheel out the research, the evidence, if you like, principally in the form of winemaker, researcher and assistant professor Panagiotis Arapitsas, co-author of a recent paper entitled Flint Glass Bottles Cause White Wine Aroma Identity Degradation. Now, where he uses the term flint glass, we're using the term clear glass, probably inappropriately.
Well, I think we always try to be as inappropriate as possible, generally.
But I think we all know what we're talking about.
Hopefully we all know what we're talking about. Anyway, this paper is fascinating for many reasons. It's the result of experiments that have been going on over many years now, I think about 10 years. So it's not just some sort of flash in the pan. They've used more than 1,300 bottles of wine in these experiments, a fair bit of gas chromatography to measure volatile compounds, lots of good old-fashioned tasting, and no doubt a sort of fairly hefty electricity bill from all the lighting too. It definitely sheds new light on what it... Oh no, sorry. Sorry, that was inadvertent pun. Can I just flag the inadvertent pun gong there? Sorry about that. On what is exactly going on with light strike and how quickly, more importantly, it can happen. This is really intriguing new research. So Panagiotis and his co-authors studied 4 kinds of still white wine: Chardonnay, Müller-Thurgau, Gewürztraminer and Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio, all bottled in clear flint glass bottles and all exposed to light. This is what they found.
What we saw was that, especially for Chardonnay and Pinot Gris, we measured their aroma, the aroma profile, the chemical. We did a chemical analysis and we measured the aroma profile. And in the beginning, we could distinguish them very easily. But after 2 months, they seemed identical. So Chardonnay and Pinot Gris, after 2 months in flint glass, they seem identical. So we couldn't identify which wine was Pinot Gris and which one was Chardonnay. So loss of identity. And for that was a big thing to continue. And we wanted to see how fast this is happening. So we did a kinetic experiment, and then we sampled wines after 2 days, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, up until 50 days. And what we saw was that the biggest changes are happening within 7 days. So most of the changes are happening extremely fast, and that was a big shock for us. So the aromas that are coming from the grapes, that usually are terpenes and norisoprenoids, we saw that after 7 days, they decrease about, like for terpenes, between 10 to 30%, and for the norisoprenoid, up until to 70%. So in 1 week, we were losing a huge amount of these aroma compounds that are coming from the grapes, that are the identical aroma of the aroma compounds of the cultivar. What makes like Chardonnay, what makes Pinot Gris. So what is happening with this light strike, what we find out, that we are losing the identity of the wine.
Okay, so this is a really important point, and it goes to the question we posed earlier. If this is such a big problem, why don't people notice it more? You know, Panagiotis talks about terpenes and norisoprenoids. These are floral and fruity aromas. They're exactly the compounds that give grapes and wines their unique character, their beauty, if you like. And he's saying that when bottled in clear flint glass, wines can lose up to 70% of these characters, all because of light strike.
70%.
70%. I mean, this was surely the most interesting and shocking finding of their research. And the wines lose their identity as a result. You know, Chardonnay and Pinot Grigio becoming indistinguishable, essentially becoming generic white wine.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. It is shocking. It's just, it's sobering. I mean, when I talked to him, Panagiotis also cited the example of beta-damascenone, which is a norisoprenoid, very typical in Chardonnay. By itself, it smells like flowers or roses or baked apples. And what this research gets into, intriguingly, is the interplay of compounds in wine. Panagiotis called wine the richest food we consume in terms of number of metabolites. And what beta-damascenone also does is accentuate and enhance other positive aromas and compounds in the wine. And yet beta-damascenone is one of the most sensitive compounds to light, so one that was lost fastest to light strike. So we're not just talking about the loss of individual aromas here. We're also talking about the loss of the most fundamental building blocks of the whole wine. You know, light is crumbling this whole edifice, this building of a wine.
But I think the key thing here is that this is about a dampening effect. You know, the light strike is muting a wine. I mean, it's like playing your favourite song through a pillow, you know, or through white noise. Now, with your favourite song, you notice the difference because you know it so well. But with the wine, chances are you don't know it that well. You know, only really the winemakers, maybe a couple of very committed super fans know what it should taste like.
Yeah, so you could, for example, drink a Chardonnay that's been sitting in a clear glass bottle on the shelf or in the window for weeks, and you might think, you know, it's okay, it's nothing special, it's a bit dull, but it's, you know, doable, for want of a better word. But the reality is, before it was bottled, that Chardonnay tasted great. It was full of life and vibrancy and lovely flavour. You just don't know the difference.
And this is what's so frustrating and wrong, you know, because you've paid good money for that wine. You deserve to have that product in top condition, and it's not. So in effect, you're getting ripped off because of the decision to put that wine in clear glass. And the worst bit about it is it sails under the radar precisely because people don't know any better.
Yep. Yeah, it's like a stealth tax on our enjoyment, isn't it? And Panagiotis also said that their research has shown it's the suppression of the good smells and character in the wines that makes the off smells become more prominent. So the whole wet dog or boiled cabbage thing, which come from sulfur-containing compounds like dimethyl sulfide, are partly emerging in the wine because the good smells are being degraded or muted, as you said.
Yeah, and he said these things happen really quickly, didn't he? You know, within 7 days for the biggest effect.
Absolutely. You know, and some other people report it happening in a matter of minutes. But crucially, Panagiotis added 2 things. Firstly, that the effects are not reversible. So buying a light struck wine and putting it in the dark won't help. Doesn't matter how well you store it after it's been struck by light, won't help. What's more, the effects are additive or cumulative. So more exposure means the problem just gets worse. And you may well not know what's happened to that wine in the winery or anywhere along the supply chain before you get hold of it.
So I mean, really the only proper solution is to buy wine exclusively in dark or protective bottles or packaging. But what did we see when we went shopping?
Handbags. Lots and lots of handbags. No, sorry, that's a recurring nightmare I have. That's a different thing. But you're right. We went into 2 popular UK supermarkets this week, didn't we? Let's say at either end of the price and demographic spectrum. We couldn't find a single bottle of still rosé wine that wasn't in a clear, colourless glass bottle, could we?
No.
In other words, every single still rosé wine was in a clear, colourless glass bottle. A significant proportion of the white wines were also in clear glass bottles, and also quite a few sparkling wines too, particularly the rosé sparkling wines.
Yeah, we did take pictures, didn't we? We put them on our show notes. But this isn't unusual. In fact, it's the norm, and it's not just supermarkets. To be fair, you know, similar things happen in bars and restaurants, and probably our homes too. You know. Actually, we were told an alarming tale, weren't we, by a top champagne producer of how they were delighted a few years back when their best vintage wines were listed at one of London's swankiest new restaurants, which happened to be one of those with lots of big windows. And when they visited, they found their wines sitting there in the full glare of the sun and daylight, and the wines were utterly ruined. But they were still being sold to unsuspecting punters.
It's shocking, and it happens all the time. Right. I think we need to take a breath, have a pause, let all of this sink in. Coming up, we're going to be donning our safety glasses and blindfold for our sobering experiment. We're going to hear more from Panagiotis and other experts as we reveal the true potential scale of this issue and give our advice on what should be done about it. To recap so far, light strike is an insidious wine fault. It destroys aromas and character in white, rosé and sparkling wine in clear, colourless glass bottles. It can happen surprisingly fast, and it's irreversible. It's a serious issue, but one that is neither widely recognised nor given the attention it deserves. This has to change.
And yet it seems we see more and more wines in clear glass rather than less. So the question is, why is that? Why are wines put into clear glass in the first place? So we asked Panagiotis.
Flint glass is something that probably we shouldn't use. And the problem it comes from us as a consumer. So I'm a consumer also myself. And usually what they say is when we go and we buy a product, we want to see the product. And we believe that if we see the product, we can check the quality of the product. I don't know any winemaker that wants to put its wine in a flint glass. So usually it is due to the marketing options that they will tell you, consumers want to see the product. So you have to put it in flint glass. And usually that happens with low budget wine, like between, 4 euros and 10 euros. The production of a flint glass, apparently it seems that it costs less than a colored one. This is a huge problem, yes.
So it's basically down to marketing. The marketeers and the retailers are saying people want to see the wine before they buy it, particularly rosé, because I guess it's pink and it's pretty. So the blame is being shifted to us, the people who buy the wine. And to a certain extent, we are to blame because we keep buying the stuff and we don't want to talk about or recognise or push back against the potentially very significant downsides. And this becomes a vicious cycle.
It certainly does, yeah. So this supposed desire to see the wine, to check its quality, is ironically contributing to its lack of quality. The science is clearly telling us this is an issue, and yet you literally can't buy a single still rosé wine in a supermarket that's not in a clear bottle. There's not even a choice.
Yeah. And there's also the nagging question of whether this is being driven by cost too. If clear colourless glass bottles are cheaper than the darker ones, and it's often the cheaper wines that they're used for, isn't it? So question marks there. Anyway, there's no actual need to see your wine before you buy it either. It's not always a helpful guide to its quality or style anyway. Certainly not enough to justify putting its quality at significant risk. I don't need to see my crisps or cheese or whatever. I'd rather they just tasted good when I open them.
Particularly cheesy crisps. No, but you could easily have those wines in dark glass bottles or bag-in-boxes or cans, frankly.
Yep.
Maybe with a picture of the wine colour either on the label or the shelf marker or, some fancy QR code video type thing. I don't know. Or even just, what about some sacrificial display bottles and then put the wine for buying in a dark bottle or a box or protect it somehow? Anyway, we're going to come on to solutions and recommendations in a moment. But for now, we wanted to talk a bit more about the scale of this issue.
And talk about our experiment too. Don't forget our experiment. Very, very important in all this. I've got my safety goggles standing by.
I've got my blindfold.
Do love a pair of safety goggles. So keep focused. So if we recognise that this problem sails under the radar, but given the amount of wine you see in clear, colourless glass bottles on the shelves, it's potentially quite widespread. How big an issue is this? How worried should we all be? So we put this question to a few people. One was Liz Gabay, a fellow master of wine and renowned rosé wine expert, whom I asked what the proportion of rosé wine spoiled by light strike is.
High.
And when you say high?
So if we're doing a tasting, I would say 30%.
So a third of all rosé, in your opinion, in clear bottles, is spoiled.
Yes. So
if you were to describe this in very basic terms for our listeners, what should they look out for in terms of if they buy a rosé in a clear bottle? What would be the warning signs of light strike? What would they smell?
So when it's just beginning, you can get that slightly savoury, vegetal, herbal character, which does give some complexity. And that just gets stronger and stronger till you get that school cabbage smell. And then you just know that it's not right. I mean, when I first started tasting rosé, I thought the same. I thought, it's the garrigue, the famous garrigue flavour of Provence rosé. And now I'm beginning to think, actually, I think it's light strike, invariably.
And that savoury vegetal character presumably is likely to be the floral, fruity character being suppressed, like Panagiotis said. But 30%, a third of rosé spoiled, according to Liz. I mean, that's really interesting.
Yeah, concerning, I'd say. And she tastes probably more rosé than anyone else in the world. I also asked Panagiotis how big an issue this is.
I was talking once upon a time with some people that they organize big exhibition of wine in Italy, and he was saying that 80% of the wines that they were tasting in exhibition, wine exhibition in Italy, that they were in flint glass, they had the problem. So 80%.
80%.
And 80%, 80. So, but many people, they just don't, since they are not able to recognize the problem, they think that it's not there. That's why it's important to start to learn how to recognize the problem. So it's huge. Some wines, they will develop the problem after 2 days, some others after 1 month, some after 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. It will happen. You cannot avoid that. And you cannot turn back.
So Liz was talking about rosé wine. Panagiotis is talking anecdotally about one experience with all wine styles in clear glass. But that's 30 to 80%. However you look at it, that is not trivial.
No. And it's hard to get an accurate number until people do the proper trials on this, of course. But the more you piece this together, the more worrying these potential numbers become. We've also been in touch with wine writer and sparkling wine expert Tom Stevenson, founding chair of the Champagne and Sparkling Wine World Championships, about this. And he said he introduced a safeguard of double bagging clear glass. Sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? But I'm just going to say it. Double bagging clear glass bottles in black plastic for the competition in 2015. And since doing that, the number of faulty bottles has dropped by 94%. The rest presumably being light struck before the bottles got to the competition. And
if you think, just thinking about it, we wine people, we get our knickers in a twist about cork taint, which affects anywhere between 2 and 8% of wines with a cork.
Yeah, around that.
Though actually probably less now, given the advances in cork technology and production. And we get worked up about other potential faults like oxidation or Brettanomyces spoilage or re-fermentation in bottle or whatever, which are all pretty rare.
I actually met someone recently doing her Master of Wine dissertation on mousiness taint in wine. Can't be the easiest to study.
No. I think I feel quite grateful for having done champagne now. But the evidence and reports would suggest that light strike is a far bigger issue than any of those others. Yeah. And talking of champagne, actually, we haven't really discussed that yet, but sparkling wine is relevant here too, isn't it?
Absolutely. So one of the institutions that's worked hard to communicate the dangers of light strike is Plumpton College, the UK's main wine school and research centre. And it's particularly relevant to them because the UK specialises, of course, in traditional method sparkling wine. So fizz that's made typically by longish maturation in the bottle with lees or dead yeast cells. I asked Plumpton winemaker and winemaking instructor Deepika Kaushik, who has a background in microbiology, whether certain types of wine were more susceptible to light strike.
I think so, yeah. Sparkling definitely is a whole lot more susceptible than stills.
Why are sparkling rosés particularly susceptible?
Actually, sparkling both are pretty susceptible, but it's just the yeast that do the second ferment. They release a lot of one of the precursor molecules, which is riboflavin, vitamin B2. So they just tend to release a whole lot more as a part of their fermentation process. And there are things you can put in to try to reduce the possibility of those sulfur compounds coming out. But because they spend so much time with that yeast lees, it just increases the chances of it happening. And there's not much you can do because it's happening in bottle for traditional method.
That's really interesting. So those yeasts for the second fermentation are releasing a lot of the precursors that then are converted by light into these horrible smelling things.
Yes.
Okay. So you're thinking about, with traditional methods, you're talking about champagne. You're talking about lots of most English sparkling wine.
Yeah, I think maybe the Charmat method might be slightly better, but even they age their wine with the yeast lees in tank for some time, so that's also at risk.
So by Charmat, she means tank method sparkling wine, like Prosecco or English wine made that way too, which we're starting to see more and more of. But it's really interesting, isn't it, that the traditional method fizz can be more susceptible to light strike.
It really is. I know I wasn't really aware of this. No. I thought still rosé or white would have been the most vulnerable kinds of wine, but it turns out the traditional method fizz is very susceptible. I think the thinking is, and let me see if I can get this right, is that light causes riboflavin and other photosensitive B vitamins to react with sulfur-containing amino acids like methionine and cysteine, and that creates these foul-smelling compounds like dimethyl sulfide and methanethiol. Plus, the bubbles in the fizz can then accentuate that character aromatically in the glass.
Now that is getting a bit technical, quite technical. So in layman's terms, shall we say, maturing a wine with the yeast leaves is fantastic for flavour and texture and complexity. It's what makes the greatest sparkling wines great. But it's a huge Achilles heel if you're going to then expose that wine to light.
Yeah. So the solution's pretty obvious, though, isn't it? You know, all together now. Don't use clear glass bottles. Incidentally, someone who's been a big champion of this issue and helped a fair bit with this episode as well is Brad Greatrix, senior winemaker at top English sparkling wine producer Nightimber, and friend of the pod, as we know, as a previous guest. Having looked at the evidence, you know, he takes this issue extremely seriously. Nightimber has bottled all its fizz in dark amber bottles since 2009. One of the earliest adopters, I believe. Before that, Nightimber was in green glass.
Yeah, actually, and that's an interesting point, isn't it? A little point to note here, because green glass is also quite common for wine, as we know, alongside clear glass. Green glass is more protective than clear glass, particularly when it comes to visible light. But its protective qualities vary according to wavelength, and it is vulnerable to UVA penetration, whereas dark amber blocks virtually all UVA. So green is good, but it's not great. It can still get light struck. If you want a rough guide, dark amber blocks about 90% of harmful light. Green blocks about 50+%. Clear colourless glass blocks 10%.
Okay, so it's time to get experimental. We couldn't help but do a homemade experiment. Put our money where our mouths are, as it were, to see if this thing is real.
Yeah. So we went to the supermarket and found a popular rosé sparkling wine costing £9.99 in dark glass bottles, and this was important to ensure no or minimal risk of pre-existing light strike.
Yeah, we even got a staff member to go to the storeroom to get us out some wine out of a new unopened box, didn't we? Poor chap, I'm not sure he knew quite what was happening to him, and he disappeared for a long time.
He did indeed, yeah. All for a noble cause.
That's true.
Anyway, we bought 3 bottles, we got them home, and then we started the experiment. We decanted 2 of the bottles into clear colourless glass screw cap bottles, adding some argon gas to prevent oxidation from being an issue. To be honest, though, the natural CO2 in the wines would have meant minimal risk. We sealed these clear bottles tightly, then put 1 in the window and 1 near a fluorescent light for 4 days.
Yeah, now the remaining control bottle we also decanted for consistency, but put it back in its original dark bottle with a bit of argon, sealed it up nice and tight, and returned it to the dark cellar. So that was our control. 4 days then passed, as you say. Then with great excitement, I have to add, I was allowed to blindfold Susie and get her to taste the wines to see if she could notice the difference, if you can notice the difference. But blind, so she wasn't prejudiced in any way. And this is what happened. By way of an important spoiler, glass 1 was the control. Glass 2 was the wine exposed to fluorescent light in the clear glass bottles. And glass 3 was the window or daylight exposure in the clear glass bottle. Okay, so I will pass you the glasses one by one, and they are all glasses of rosé fizz. Glass number 1.
Okay, so smells of summer fruits, raspberries, quite floral, quite fresh. Nice. And tastes the same. It's a little bit off dry, but lovely summer berry, fresh, youthful fruit.
Okay, glass number 2.
That's much more vegetal. That's different, completely different. Well, not completely different, but it is different and vegetal. And again, in the mouth, it's almost like it's overdeveloped and gone into, stewy, vegetal notes.
Okay, glass number 3.
Oh, that's different again. I mean, it's sort of flat. Yeah, lost its fruit, flat. Probably the more extreme than number 2, actually. Again, tastes the same, like it's sort of stripped of its fruit. Very different.
Okay, do you want to summarise very quickly one sentence each wine? Number one.
So wine 1, fresh, floral, summer fruits, a little bit off dry and youthful. Number 2 has got more vegetal characteristics and stripped fruit. The fruit's gone to some extent. Wine 3 is more so. It's flatter. It's not the vegetal. It's just flat, dull, and definitely lost its fruit.
So, are all 3 glasses here different?
They are all different.
They taste different.
They smell different and they taste different.
What's the best wine for you?
Wine 1, because it's fresh and youthful and fruity and, of its type, I would have thought.
And what's the worst wine?
The third one, because it's just so flat and stripped.
Interesting. And just to add, I will put photos of Susie blindfolded in our show notes, just to prove we did actually do this and for a bit of fun too.
Thank you for that. Excellent.
You probably didn't even know I was taking the photos, did you?
Well, I was blindfolded.
The joy of blindfolds. We should do it more often. Anyway, a very clear result there. No room for doubt. 100% taint rate. Would you agree?
Yeah. No,
the effect of light strike really is very obvious. I also tasted the wines and the impact was unmistakable. If you want to check it out for yourself, or if you're doubtful about all of this, you can do exactly this experiment at home, and you will see the light.
Yeah. And interesting that for me, the daylight was the worst.
Yes.
I guess perhaps because it can be quite strong and it includes, all the wavelengths of light. And that had really stripped the wine of character. It really had. And then the fluorescent lighting had made it more vegetal, which you might have thought was okay in terms of character. It was drinkable. But you could only really see the severity of the problem, the starkness of the issue when you compared it to the original untainted bottle, which was just so much fresher and fruitier and, more balanced.
That's the thing. And this was only after 4 days too, Panagiotis did it in 7, and it was winter. So the daylight really wasn't that bright at all. I mean, I think we had 1 day of slightly sort of weakish sun.
We had 1 day of sun, didn't we? Yeah. Winter sun.
Further corroborating the point that this can happen fast and in conditions that are far from extreme.
So the question is, what can be done about this? What should be done about it?
I reckon we, set up the barricades, set lights and tyres, start kicking things, civil unrest, that sort of thing. What do you reckon?
Or we could just not buy wine in clear, colourless glass.
Or you could do that too. Yeah.
Less dramatic.
Yeah.
That's what Brad from Night Timber does, doesn't it?
It is. You're right. He says he's aware, by doing this, not buying any wine in clear, colourless glass at all, that he might miss out on some potentially great wines, but he just won't buy the stuff in clear glass because the risk of taint is too high. And I have to think that is the only way forward.
Yeah.
Tom Stevenson's the same. Tom's advice, and I quote, is clear glass bottles are marketing madness. Producers blame the marketing people, but it is fundamentally a quality control issue, and no self-respecting producer should allow marketing to overrule quality control. They should switch to dark glass bottles and move on. The best solution would be to ban clear glass bottles by law. He advises people never to purchase a clear bottle of any wine straight from the shelf, particularly sparkling wine.
Strong words, though I would expect no less from Tom.
Indeed, yeah.
And Panagiotis said similar things, didn't he? Producers shouldn't use clear glass, and we wine consumers should use our purchasing power to help change this crazy situation.
So I want to ensure, to all the consumers, that when a winemaker decide to put its white wine or its rosé wine in a dark color bottle, he doesn't or she doesn't want to hide something from the consumer. What he or she want to do is to protect, to give to the consumer the best quality possible. So trust these winemakers and try to change a bit. We, like also myself, we start to change our behavior of how we are buying foods and wine. Also, try to avoid as much possible flint glass, and that will also change, I think, so all the bottling or the packaging of the wine.
So your advice for people, normal people going out to buy wine, would be to avoid wine in clear flint glass?
Yes, that is my advice. So it's better to avoid that. If we change our behavior, I think so everything will, like also the packaging will change.
The original title of your research paper was about wine being naked, as far as I understand. Why was that?
Okay, so in English, the title is of the fairy tale is
The Emperor's New Clothes.
Yeah, the Emperor's New Clothes. So that the king is naked, and the child said, "Okay, look, the king is naked." We believe that we have a packaging in the wine, and we protect it somehow, and it's very beautiful as a packaging, like the flint glass. And but at the end of the day, the wine is naked. It doesn't have any clothes. It needs like a bottle that is a packaging that is not transparent and it's protecting the wine. So that's why we play a bit with this naked. I also like to use sometimes the terms stupid. Like we have on the one part, we are in a period that we talk about smartphones, smart computers, smart doors, or whatever. And that we can say that on the opposite side is like this type of a stupid packaging.
So clear flint glass is the stupid packaging in a world of smart tech.
Apparently, yes. So if we know the problem, I think so we can solve it. If we're just trying to hide the problem, it is not it's not the correct thing that we need to do.
You said we'd come back to the Emperor's New Clothes.
I did, and here we are. So Panagiotis did actually allude to it in his research paper for that very reason, that essentially we're allowing the wine to be naked, and we're all pretending it's okay, when really we need to be like the innocent child who recognises the absurdity of the situation and says, enough of this madness, put some flipping clothes on.
I'm hearing Nelson from The Simpsons right now. I don't know about anyone else. That'll be lost on you. And
Slightly.
somebody will pick up it. Anyway, I would just mention before we finish that people have looked into other potential solutions. So Deepika mentioned winemaking techniques that can be done, like fining with bentonite or charcoal to reduce precursor compounds in the wines to make them less susceptible to light strike. She also mentioned adding enological tannins. And another paper said chestnut tannins help prevent it too.
But I mean, to be honest, none of those are things you really want to do to a wine out of choice, particularly sparkling wine, because it's going to ultimately affect the taste, especially when there is a far easier solution. Just put the bloody stuff in dark bottles.
Or cans or whatever.
Yeah.
And just to finish up on this, another paper suggested you could use coatings on bottles to block short wavelengths. But again, that gets messy when you start thinking about heavy metals going into recycling loops. These bottles need to be recycled. So if you start putting weird stuff on them, that's not going to work. Plus, that's more expensive.
Yeah, and then things like boxes or sleeves are going to get removed. So, just use appropriate packaging. And this particularly needs to be borne in mind in an era where, bottles are getting lighter to reduce carbon emissions from shipping. So that also means they can offer less protection, even less protection from light. So again, the same rules apply. The darker, the better.
Yeah. Now, given the wine world isn't going to change overnight, despite this sensational programme, scandal, they're not suddenly going to ditch clear glass.
No.
What advice would we give to people who love their favourite rosé that only currently comes in its clear, colourless glass bottle?
Well, in a shop or restaurant, just don't buy the first bottle that you're presented with. Ask to buy bottles that are still in their cardboard box, ideally from a dark cellar or storeroom. If you're really pushed in the supermarket, choose a wine from the back of the shelf, furthest away from the light. And then if you're outdoors where bottles might stand out in the sun for a while, just think about keeping the bottles in those chillable wine sleeves, or better still, pop them back into your picnic box, say, when you're not pouring them. And then at home, you can store your wine in the dark. You have the ability to do that. Do it.
Yeah, you can always coat your bottles in tinfoil if you're really that way minded, but I'm not sure that will work for you. Also, one thing I'd add is maybe go for an aromatic wine. This is interesting because Panagiotis' research showed that very aromatic wines can cope better with light strike because they have more aromatic compounds to start with, so they take longer to degrade.
Yeah.
So if you have to choose a wine in a clear bottle, go for a Sauvignon Blanc or a Gewürztraminer or a Muscat or whatever. You stand more chance it will be okay in this sort of crazy lottery. And just avoid traditional method fizz in clear bottles above all.
I mean, more of those do tend to come in darker bottles anyway,
That's
I
true.
would say.
Yep.
And then, from a bigger picture point of view, we'd like to see wine people talking about this more. We'd like to see producers ditch clear flint glass bottles entirely on point of principle, wouldn't we?
Yep.
And retailers back them up on this. And then we'd like to see particularly wineries, but also shops and restaurants using less harsh light. Maybe using more warm orange wavelengths rather than colder blues and whites.
Yeah, that would make your average shopping experience a little less stark and clinical too, wouldn't it? Maybe a bit more romantic, even, dare I say.
I know you think shopping is fun now, but there are limits. But no, I mean, let's see more dark bottles, also more cans and bag-in boxes. Why not? As I said, people can be creative here. They could use pictures on labels, like we've said, or QR codes or smart shelf markers that show videos or GIFs of the wine being poured. Or on a much more functional level, have, as we've said, a couple of sacrificial bottles people can see, and then the rest in boxes or covered up.
So it's war on clear glass bottles, war on misplaced marketing pressure. And let's make wine great again.
I think I've heard that somewhere before. Anyway, time for a closing summary. Light strike can ruin wine, and fast, particularly sparkling white and rosé in clear flint glass bottles. The scale of the issue is big and it's not going away. If anything, quite the opposite. Nevertheless, it's an issue that producers, distributors and retailers seem keen to ignore or brush under the carpet. The best thing we wine lovers can do for now is simply steer well clear of wine in clear glass bottles and keep telling the scandalous tale of the emperor's new wine clothes.
We'll put links to studies and some really interesting graphics on our website show notes, plus photos, including Susie in a blindfold. So don't miss all that.
Very lucky.
Our thanks to Panagiotis Arapitsas, Deepika Kaushik, Liz Gabay, MW, Tom Stevenson, and Brad Greatrix. Thanks also to you for listening. Until next time, cheers.